Let's talk about solving equations where we may need to use the distributive property. So some equations are going to have grouping symbols, and these grouping symbols are called parentheses. They look like this. And there's actually two different ways that we can solve equations that have these parentheses. Okay, so the first side is you can divide both sides of the equation by the number that's in front of the parentheses. Okay, sometimes that works. Sometimes it would not come out to be a whole number, so you might want to try this other way. If you can't divide, or if it's not going to come out a whole number, you use what we call the distributive property. The distributive property is the way that we multiply. You take whatever number is outside the parentheses and you multiply it by each term inside the parentheses. If you have parentheses and then something added or subtracted to the parentheses before the equal sign, then you're going to have to use the second way by using the distributive property. All right, so check for and combine like terms if you've got them after you've done the distributive property. And then you're just going to solve it like a one or two step equation using your inverse operations. All right, let's solve some examples. Let's do them each way. Okay, so let's start with the dividing way. Okay, so here's our first example. We have 2 on the outside. That's being multiplied by the expression 2x plus 8 equals 24. So we can solve this by dividing both sides of the equation by 2. Okay, 2 divided by 2 is 1. So that's like 1 times 2x plus 8, which is just 2x plus 8. And then we will calculate this side of the equation. 24 divided by 2 equals 12. Okay, so now we've simplified and we don't have those parentheses anymore. This is just a two-step equation. Okay, so I'm going to box the 12. Remember the box method, we box the term that's by itself. Box the 12, which means we cannot move it. And I'm going to move the plus 8 by inverse operations. So the inverse of adding 8 is subtracting 8. So we'll write it under the 8 and in the box. That gives us a 0 pair right here. So I can bring down my 2x and then calculate 12 minus 8, which is 4. All right, my last step is to box the 4. So don't move that. I want to undo 2x. And remember my little rhyme. 2 and the x are side by side, so we need to divide. So we'll divide both sides by 2. So 4 divided by 2 gives me x equals 2. So that's one way of solving an equation that has parentheses. We can divide both sides by whatever number's in front of the parentheses. Let's talk about why we would sometimes want to use the distributive property instead of just dividing. Let's look at this example. Now don't write this down yet, just watch. If I were to solve this by dividing, I would divide both sides by 12. When I calculate 4 divided by 12, I'm going to get a decimal, which is fine. You're going to have equations that have decimals in them, but we can solve this without having to use a decimal. So let's try the distributive property. Distributive property is just multiplication. So we would multiply 12 times negative 2x, which would be negative 24x. And then we would do 12 times positive 3, which is positive 36. Do not multiply 12 times 4, only the two things inside the parentheses. So this is just going to stay equals 4. Now once we've multiplied that out, it's a two-step equation. So I will box the term that's by itself. In this case, it's the 4. Okay, If I box the 4, I'm going to move the 36. The inverse of adding 36 would be subtracting 36. So I'll put it here and in the box. 36 and negative 36 give me a 0 pair. So bring down negative 24x equals, all right, calculate your box. 4 subtract 36 is negative 32. Okay, then we will divide both sides by the coefficient of x. So divide both sides by negative 24. Okay, that gives me positive 1x. Now, I still have a fraction, but that's okay. Let's remember our integer rules. A negative divided by a negative is a positive, so my answer is going to be positive. 32 divided by 24, we can reduce it. We can change it to a mixed number. So 24 goes into 32 one time. Okay, there's going to be 8 left over, so 1 and 8 over 24. And then we can reduce our fraction by 8. So that's going to give me 1 and 1/3. Just like that. All right, let's take a few more examples. We're going to get to choose a method and then we'll solve it. All right, let's look at the first one. If you think you might want to divide, check to see if it would come out to be a whole number. So if we solve this by dividing, we would divide both sides by negative 7. Okay, so that cancels, and I have x minus 2 equals, all right, let's calculate this box. 14 divided by negative 7 would be negative 2. Okay, box the term that's by itself. It's going to be this negative 2. So we're going to move the minus 2. The inverse would be to add 2. Negative 2 plus 2 is a 0 pair, so I have x equals. Now, when you calculate this box, we also have negative 2 plus 2, which is also 0. So my answer here is x equals 0. That tends to bother some people when they get 0. They think that they got the answer wrong, but 0 is a number and it is a valid answer. All right, let's look at this one. We need to choose if we're going to divide or distribute. Now, what I was saying earlier is if you have another term that's being added or subtracted to the parentheses, you have to use distributive property. So since we have that minus 2x that's on the same side as the parentheses, we're going to have to use distributive property here. So our first step is to multiply by 3. 3 times 2x is 6x. And 3 times positive 1 is positive 3. That's the only two things that you multiply by the 3. Everything else stays the same, so I'm just going to rewrite it. All right, I want to stop right here because I've got some like terms. I have 6x and I have minus 2x. So in my thought bubble over here, I'm thinking 6 subtract 2. And I'm subtracting because there's a minus right here. That's going to give me 4x. I still have plus 3 equals 31. So now I'm ready to actually solve. Box the 31 because that's the only thing on the right side of the equation. If I box 31, I'm going to move my 3. It's adding 3, so the inverse would be subtracting 3 here and in the box. All right, 0 pair right there. So I have 4x equals 31 subtract 3 gives me 28. All right, last step, box the 28. The 4 and the x are side by side, so we need to divide. Divide both sides of the equation by 4. 4 divided by 4 gives me 1x. And 28 divided by 4 gives me 7. So my answer there would be x equals 7. All right, last example. Again, we have that minus 9 that's after the parentheses. So we're going to have to use the distributive property on that one. All right, we're going to do negative 4 times x, which is negative 4x. Now, when I do this next multiplication, I'm going to think negative 4 times positive 1. That gives me negative 4. So instead of writing plus negative 4, I'm just going to write subtract 4. Copy down the rest of your problem like that. Again, I've got 3 things on the left side of my equation, so something needs to go together. I have 2 constants, and remember, a constant is a number that does not have a variable. So I've got 2 constants. They happen to be side by side, so I'm just going to circle them like this. All right, in my thought bubble, I'm thinking negative 4 subtract 9, which is negative 13. I'm going to leave this in order, though, so I'm going to put my negative 4x still first, and then my negative 13 I'll write as minus 13. And then I still have equals 11. Okay, box the term that's by itself, which is the 11. All right, if I box the 11, I'm going to move my minus 13. And the inverse of subtracting 13 is adding 13. Okay, cross out your 0 pair. Negative 4x equals, all right, 11 plus 13 we'll calculate, and we get 24. And then the last step, when they're side by side, you need to divide. So we will divide by negative 4. Notice I did not change my sign. Okay, negative 4 divided by negative 4 is positive 1. 1x is just x. And then calculate 24 divided by negative 4, which is going to be negative 6. Careful with your signs. And that is how you solve equations that have grouping symbols or parentheses.